Right, so it's a great pleasure to have Jason Cantarella to give us a talk for GeoTop-A. And so, Jason, to you.
Thank you very much, Renzo. So first off, thank you all for inviting me to give a talk in the online seminar. I've been following along with these on YouTube a bit and really interesting set of talks. So thank you guys for setting this up. Um, Today, hopefully everyone can see my screen. I'm going to talk about a new-ish project, and this is an extension of the kind of random polygon work that my group has been doing for some years. But now we're going to go past polygons to arbitrary topologies. So here we go. Um, just to give a little background, because I know these are a broad audience, um, usually in polymer science, you have linear polymers like these ones I'm indicating with the mouse down below. And if the ends bond to each other, you can form ring polymers or cyclic polymers. And those are actually reasonably hard to make chemically, uh, essentially because you have to get the ends close enough to bond. So in fact, now people are good enough at this to make a recyclizable polymer where you can change it from a linear melt to a melt of rings and go back and forth. So here's a picture of that. Um, the purple one is the ring phase, and the clear one is the linear phase. So it's exactly the same chemical composition, but what you can see is that the chemical and the material properties depend on the topology of the polymer. So same concentration, same chemicals, same end groups, same everything, except on the right, the end groups are bonded together, so you have rings, and on the left, the end groups are not bonded together, so you have linear chains. And there's really no solvent here. So this is almost pure polymer. Okay, so a topological polymer is different from a linear or a ring polymer in that it joins the monomers in some graph rather than simply a cycle or a linear chain. So the way this is usually done is that there are chemical groups that form the junctions, which are usually of known valence, 3 or 4 or 5 or something. And then there's a different monomer that has two-way junctions. And then there's some chain of monomers forming arcs. And there's a certain number of these junction molecules in each polymer group. So the setup that we'll be trying to model eventually is a sort of structure graph on the outside. In this case, it's a theta graph, subdivided into a large number of edges along each edge of the initial structure graph that represent monomers or persistence lengths of monomers along the linear sections. So topological polymers happen all the time. This is rubber, which is a network polymer where there are lots of junctions. This is a hydrogel, but it gives an impression of what the network is thought to be like. And you see here that it's a large, complicated graph. The, the degree of each vertex is controlled. Here it's degree 3 mostly. And they're probably random graphs, maybe with loops or multiple edges. So it's now the case that several labs can synthesize topological polymers in quantities large enough to study. So For instance, here is a picture that I took at the Tezuka lab at Tokyo Tech, and this is a beaker of theta curves. So I always have to stop for a minute to appreciate this, because somewhere in the world there is a beaker of theta curves, and it's green. Um, this is fascinating to me. So uh, here is a diagram of the topologies that Tezuka's lab produces by their process. And you can see that it sort of starts with a ring polymer, and then there are modifications that happen to it. So you can get a theta curve, and then another set of products is this ladder graph, um, this K33 up here. There's a complete graph on 4 vertices, which I guess is here. Or you can go down another branch and get this thing called the handcuffs graph, and these things, which are lasso graphs or lasso polymers. So the interesting thing is, given a solution, and this happens randomly, remember, so we have a certain fraction of each of these products in the solution, how do we separate out the different graph types? And what properties do we expect to depend on the graph type? So Tezuka calls this the Cambrian explosion of topological polymers, because it took a very long time to make the ring polymer, but now new polymer topologies, new graphs are appearing very regularly in the chemical literature. Okay, so here is the math question. A linear polymer is a simple model. It's a random walk where the edges are chosen independently from some distribution, and they're just lined up end to end. In a ring polymer, the edges are not independent because there's some global condition that the start and end are at the same place. So we have to condition the choice of edges on the closure condition. And of course, in a topological polymer, we have to condition the edges on graph type. So before I start setting up the model, let's just think about that for a moment. If you have a ring polymer where the edges are conditioned on closure, what you want is for the sum of the edge vectors to be 0. So somehow you've got to restrict your choice of edge vectors by a linear condition that their sum is 0. Now, of course, if you have a more complicated graph, a ladder graph or a complete graph on 4 vertices or something, the tetrahedron, then you have several different loops, and some edges are part of more than one loop. So the question really is, how do you enforce several closure conditions at the same time? So just to set up notation, I'm going to distinguish between the vertex positions of a graph. Those are going to be given by a vector that I'll call x, and the edges of the graph, which will be a vector that I call w. And the idea is the w's tell you the displacements between x's. So just to pick an example, if I want to talk about w2, that's this vector here, giving you edge 2 in the graph. That vector goes from vertex 2 to vertex 3. So here is vertex 2, that's the second part of the vertex vector, to vertex 3, that's the third part of the vertex vector. And the relation we get is something like x sub 3 minus x sub 2 equals v sub 2. So this is a linear relationship between these two vectors. And if you write down all of these relationships, you get a matrix called the incidence matrix. And it looks like this. You get a +1 in ij if vi is the head of edge ej, a -1 if vi is the tail of ej, a 0 if ej is a loop edge and vi is both the head and the tail, and a 0 if it's neither the head nor the tail. So for instance, let's find edge 2 again. So I've transposed the matrix. So edge 2 is the second row. And this says it goes from vertex 2, that's the tail, to vertex 3, that's the head. Okay, so the B matrix takes vertex positions to edge vectors. Okay, so if we want to think about, B transpose takes vertex positions to edge vectors. So if we want to think about the space of possible edges, we're really thinking of the edges that can come from a set of vertex positions. For instance, if we have a cyclic polymer, then only edges where all the edge vectors sum to 0 will be in the image of B transpose. All of the other combinations of edges aren't in image of B transpose because they don't sum to 0, so they can't come from the vertices of a cyclic polygon or a cycle graph. So we want to carve out the image of B transpose, which is the space of embeddable edge vectors. Okay, now here's the idea. On this linear subspace of edge space, we'll just have a standard multivariate Gaussian. So we can define this Gaussian either intrinsically on the subspace or by projecting a standard Gaussian from all of edge space to the image of B transpose. It's a property of Gaussians that you get the same multivariate Gaussian either way. Okay, we'd like to push this distribution back to vertex space. So we'd like to apply B transpose inverse to it. Unfortunately, B transpose is not an invertible matrix. So we'll need one more trick. The trick we need is called the pseudo-inverse. If you define your matrix in terms of singular values, the pseudo-inverse just inverts all the singular values, but it only does it to the ones that are non-zero. If you have a 0 singular value, it leaves it alone. So the inverse matrix would invert all the singular values. And of course, if there was a 0 singular value, then the inverse matrix would not be defined. So A plus, the pseudo-inverse, is the inverse if it's invertible, and otherwise it's as close as possible to the inverse. So the use of the pseudo-inverse is it's a way to encode solutions of least squares problems. So if A plus V equals X, then it's not the case that AX equals V, but AX is the closest vector in the image of A to V. That's the orthogonal projection of V to the image. And in fact, going this way, the image of A plus is the orthogonal complement of the kernel of the matrix A. So here's the model. B transpose goes this way from vertex space to edge space. B transpose plus goes back from edges to vertices. This reconstructs all the vertex positions from the corresponding edge displacements. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a standard Gaussian on the image of B transpose, push it forward by B transpose plus to vertex space, and get a non-standard Gaussian. And that non-standard Gaussian will give us the positions of vertices in a random embedding of the graph with this incidence matrix. So I'll just pause for a moment for questions, because this picture is kind of the basic idea. This is the whole thing so far.
Wow, this is interesting. I wonder if, well, I'm just looking the slide you are on the show, and is any information we can get from looking at eigenvalues or eigenvectors in
Oh,
studying these
very,
matrices BT?
very much so. And we'll
Mm,
get to that soon. But that's
right.
exactly the right question to ask, right?
Okay.
What are the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of the matrices? Well, these aren't square, so singular values and singular vectors of the matrices BT and BT plus. Or as we'll see, their product turns out to be an important thing as well.
Okay, so I have a question, and is really basic. Has to do. So I presume, did I understand correctly? You dealing with matrices that by their own constructions are only 3 by 3. Is that correct? Maybe not.
No, no.
No.
This the
Because,
edge space is R to the 3e. So if we're embedding the
okay,
graphs in 3 space, it's 3 times the number of edges. And vertex
good.
space is R to the 3v. It's v vertex positions, each of which is in R3. So these
Okay,
matrices
thanks.
can be rather large.
Rather large. Okay. So
Okay.
do you come across matrices that have zero sum along one of the lines, row or columns?
Oh, yes, you certainly do. Um, Now, those won't show up as, let's see, in fact, if we scroll back, right, you can see that this matrix B
Okay,
transpose has 0 row sums, right? Because
that's
each
right.
one represents an edge that goes from somewhere to somewhere else.
That's exactly what triggered my question.
Okay. And you don't necessarily have 0 column sums, right? Because the column sums more or less count the number of edges going into a vertex minus the number of edges going out of the vertex. Um, so if I look at vertex 3 here, 1 comes in and 2 go out. So the column sum here is -1.
So my final question about this matrix is, for you, apart from the construction, do they have particular meaning, these zero-sum elements, the zero-sum lines? Because
Well,
they
so
occur on time to time, and for me it's hard. Sometimes there is a mysterious meaning that is not quite obvious. I wonder if you can add a comment to that.
well, yeah, I can tell you sort of exactly what the meaning is. So if you think of going from vertices to edges, this process of subtracting tail position from head position is like taking the gradient of a function. It's
Yeah,
a difference. Uh, so
right.
if I were to add the same vector to all the vertices, I wouldn't change the differences, the relative positions at all. So a constant vector is in the kernel of B transpose. And that's exactly what it means to have row sum 0, right? That the vector of all ones or something is part of your kernel. So it means, the theory is translation invariant.
Good. Thank you. Interesting.
Excellent. Those are good questions, as always. Um, okay, so I think I'll continue unless there are other questions from the audience. Okay, so I'll pause again in a few minutes. Um, okay, so let me point out that you can already use the construction of B transpose plus to generate examples of Gaussian embeddings of any graph type. So for instance, the path graph, you get a Gaussian random walk. For the cycle graph, you get a Gaussian random polygon. And here, for this complete graph on 4 vertices, you get an interesting new embedding where I've indicated the vertices of degree 3 by coloring them in orange. And you can see that they do indeed have 3 edges coming into them. So whatever edge set I generated, it satisfies the properties that the sum around here is 0, the sum around here is 0, the sum around here is 0, and of course if you obey all those conditions, it implies that the sum around the perimeter is 0. So this selection of edge vectors from a particular Gaussian has obeyed all the conditions. Okay, so let's think about the image of B transpose plus. We know it's the orthogonal complement of the kernel of B transpose. And as Renzo noticed, the fact that the row sums are 0 means that the kernel of B transpose is just the constant vectors. This means that the image of B transpose plus will be the centered embeddings. Those are just going to be embeddings where the center of mass of all the vertex positions is 0. Okay, so the theorem then is that if you push forward a Gaussian through a linear map, the covariance matrix of the linear map is transformed in this way. We multiply by the standard Gaussian by sort of B transpose plus transpose times B transpose plus, and the two transposes cancel, and what you end up with is a multivariate Gaussian whose covariance matrix is given by BB transpose plus. And that's supported on the space of centered embeddings inside R to the V. This is true for each coordinate independently. So if we're embedding into R3, we pick the X coordinates from this normal, then the Y coordinates independently from this normal, then the Z coordinates independently from this normal, and then those triples are the positions in space. Now, this matrix here, BB transpose, that's a really interesting matrix. This is the graph Laplacian. So the eigenvectors and eigenvalues of this are going to tell us about the distribution of vertex positions. And they're going to tell us rather a lot more about the polymer chemistry itself. So just to write it out explicitly, it turns out that on the diagonal, you get the degree of the vertex, but loop edges don't count. So you subtract 2 for every loop edge because neither the incoming, neither the outgoing nor incoming edge counts towards the degree. Off the diagonal, you count the net number of edges connecting the two vertices. So if some go from I to j and others go from j to I, remember all our edges are oriented, then they can cancel in pairs, but we're left with some net number of edges going from one to the other. So, and I should say that some version of this sort of echoes back through the literature, maybe as far as the initial papers on elasticity in the 40s, although the notation was different and they didn't call it the graph Laplacian at that point, and it wasn't really clear what to do for multigraphs. But definitely people have had this basic idea before. Okay, so I'm just rewriting the theorem from the last page, but I want to notice that if my vertices are sampled from this normal distribution, then the distance between them is, well, it's the expectation of the square of two coordinates in our multivariate normal, which, expanding it out, is the expectation of the square of one plus the square of the other minus twice the product. But remember that these are covariances. So in particular, you can read these right off from the covariance matrix here. So in particular, the expectation of fi squared is the diagonal element in L plus. The expectation of fj squared is the diagonal element j in L plus. And these guys are Lij and Lji. L is a symmetric matrix, so these are actually the same. And of course, if I take the expectation of the sum of a bunch of these squares, because I embedded in Rd, I just multiply by d. So this tells us that the vertex positions can be read off from the pseudo-inverse of the graph Laplacian. That's already interesting because we're reading out geometry from the structure of the graph directly. Okay, so at this point, you've got to wonder what L plus is, right? So remember that the inverse to a matrix encodes solutions to problems in the form AX equals E1, AX equals E2, AX equals E3. Those guys are the rows of the matrix A inverse. And the same thing is true for the matrix A plus. So the ith row of L plus is the solution to a Poisson problem, Laplacian equals something, discrete Poisson problem. But they share so many features with the standard Poisson problem with the standard Laplacian that the name makes sense. It's the solution to this problem. I put a unit of divergence at vertex I, and then I subtract off a little divergence from every other vertex, and I solve Laplacian x equals this. This is a graph. These are entries in the ith row, and what they are just recording what the solution is to the Poisson problem. Here's I in this picture. Okay, now further, if you have a different Poisson problem, if I put a unit of positive divergence at one vector at one location and a unit of the other sign of divergence at another location, then it turns out that the difference between the height of the solutions at these 2 points is exactly this magical looking quantity. It's L plus II minus L plus IJ, 2 guys in the ith row, plus L plus JJ minus L plus JI, 2 guys in the jth row. So I've used superposition of solutions here to read this out as the difference of solutions to 2 different Poisson problems. And notice that it has the beautiful feature that it's linear everywhere but the 2 points of positive and negative divergence. Okay, now when you have, so you might ask yourself, when in physics do I have a harmonic function which has a unit of divergence somewhere and another unit of divergence somewhere else? And of course, no divergence any place other than that. And the answer is electricity, right? So that's essentially Kirchhoff's laws. So what this tells you is that our expression is the resistance that you'd measure between vertex I and vertex J if all the edges were unit resistors. So this, I think, is a really beautiful thing because it identifies the expected squared distance between, say, vertex 1 and vertex 15 with the resistance that you'd measure if you put voltage plus 1 at vertex 1 and minus 1 at vertex 15 and let it flow through the rest of the network. According to the guy who writes XKCD, the resistance here is about 3/4. So that would say that the expected squared distance is dimension times 3/4. Okay, so let's just do an example now. A graph that polymer scientists can actually make is these M arc N edge theta graphs. So there are M linear polymers that are joined together at their start and at their end. And each one of them has N monomers, or N persistence lengths of monomers, going from start to finish. And the question is, what is the expected squared distance between the junctions? We already know if this was a ring polymer, we'd expect these 2 points to be closer than they were if they were just the ends of a linear polymer that was half as long. So what if we keep adding junctions? And now that we understand that this is a resistance problem, you can do this in your head. So of course, these are resistors in series. So each has resistance N because there are N unit resistors in series. On the other hand, there are M of these resistors in parallel. So we're summing up 1 over N, 1 over N, M times, giving us M over N, but that is 1 over the total resistance. So we get this formula that the expected distance is the dimension you're embedding the graph in, this is usually 3, times N, the number of monomers in each arc, divided by M. And this is, of course, a classic result for ring polymers that you get N over 2 for the ring polymer, where you got N over 1 for the linear polymer. So this is considered interesting by the chemists because what happens is if you put, say, 20 of these arcs in, you would always expect the junctions to be very close together, even as the embeddings of the monomer chains around them extended out quite far from where these junctions were. So if the junction is a drug molecule and the monomers are starches or something, the drug is hidden in this cloud of starches um, until it gets where you want it to go. This effect is called micellation. Okay, but we can say more, right? If we can compute the expectation of one squared distance, we can sum those computations to compute the expectation of all the squared distances, and that's the radius of gyration. So if we sum up all of these LII, L plus II plus L plus JJ minus L plus IJ minus L plus JI over all I's and J's, it turns out that the row sums and the column sums of the graph Laplacian disappear. So what we're left with is just the diagonal entries, the trace of L plus. So the eigenvalues of the graph Laplacian contribute to the expectation of the radius of gyration inversely. The smallest eigenvalue makes the largest contribution to the radius of gyration, and then the larger eigenvalues make less and less of a contribution. So this number turns out to come up all kinds of places in mathematical chemistry. The sum of inverse eigenvalues of the graph Laplacian is also called the Kirchhoff index. And there's a really pretty paper of Estrada and Hotano studying elasticity in molecules where their graph edges are like bonds with a potential energy associated to them. And they get this same quantity computing basically the expectation of the energy if these are all springs. Okay, so now we know something very cool, that the average size of the molecule in solution is predictable by the trace of the pseudo-inverse of its graph Laplacian. Okay, now I'm going to connect this back to chemistry, but there's one more step. So if G is some graph, perhaps with multiple edges or loop edges or something, then Gn is the graph I can create by subdividing each of the edges into n pieces. So this is G1, this is G5, this is G10, this is G20. And the question when we're modeling the topological polymers is, what should n be? We can certainly know the number of monomers connecting the two junctions because you can measure the molecular weight of the outcome of the product. So you can count monomers, and with a little more effort, you can count junctions as well because that's a different molecule. But should each of these model 1 monomer, 10 monomers, a persistence length of monomers? So we had to ask the chemists, and the chemists said there's really a pretty large number of monomers, and these things are quite flexible, so the persistence length is like 2 or 3. So assume n is big. So we made a model assuming n was big. And here's the interesting model. What you want to do is you want to take the limit as n goes to infinity of the expectation of the radius of gyration squared of the subdivided graph. It turns out that the leading term is linear in the number of vertices in the subdivided graph, and that the scaling coefficient, the leading coefficient, if you divide this expectation by the vertices, is given by this really pretty compact formula. the formula says 1 over the number of edges in the original structure graph squared plus the trace of the pseudo-inverse of a modified graph Laplacian plus 1/3 times the number of loops in the graph minus 1/6. The modified graph Laplacian is normalized sort of by degrees. So the diagonal entries are 1 if there's no loop edges, and you correct if there are loop edges. And the off-diagonal entries weight the connection by the square root of the product of the degrees of the vertices that are being connected. So this theorem, as far as we can tell, doesn't have any antecedents in the literature, though who knows, we may find some eventually. And the key idea is to use superposition of solutions to Poisson problems. So you want to solve the problem in general on a subdivided graph. You can say something about what it looks like on each edge and sort of relate things to the structure graph. So given this, we're in the position to do some examples. So this is our predictor for the relative size of the topological polymers in solution. This number should tell us something. Of course, the only way to know if it does is to get some data. Okay, so Tezuka's lab was able to synthesize a solution consisting of the following 6 graph types. It turns out that the number of junctions of each type was the same in many of these cases. So for instance, here with the ladder graph and here with the K33, they had 2 of these pink molecules. They had 4 of these yellow molecules. All the junctions were degree 3. They had the same number of green monomers everywhere. So the only thing distinguishing these is topology. So if we looked at the subdivided ones by mildly heroic computer algebra, we were able to derive an exact formula in terms of the vertices in the subdivided thing. And I just want you to notice that it really is asymptotically linear in V. The leading term in the numerator is this V cubed, and the leading term and the denominator is a V squared term. So the limit should be this magic number, 17 over 486, which, as it turns out, is exactly what you get when you compute this formula, finding the normalized graph Laplacian, computing its pseudo-inverse and the trace of that, and so forth. Okay, so you get these magic rational numbers, which are our coefficients, and though it's not obvious from the rational forms, these are actually ordered in magnitude. So as you might expect, this thing has the largest radius of gyration in solution because there are fewer bonds. All of the pink molecules are not bonded to each other. So this is most like a random walk. This turns out to be the most compact one. Things are bonded as in as many ways as possible. And these guys, our prediction is, should be in this order. And in fact, their relative sizes would be predicted by the ratios of this number. It turns out that this is a measurement you can actually make. They use a method called size exclusion chromatography, SEC. You put the solution through a column of beads, and the beads have little holes in them And the small molecules can sometimes pass through the holes and take a longer path. The large molecules can't get into the holes, so they flow between the beads. And if you run this over and over and over again, the small molecules come out last and the large molecules come out first. So here, when 7.5 milliliters of solution have come out, you start seeing these guys who made it out first. They took the fewest detours. Later on, after 8.1 or 2 milliliters of solution have come out of the column, you start seeing these guys who took many detours along the way. Their measurements gave the following relative description of the sizes. So here's how that compares to our rational numbers. So you can see that maybe there's something to it. Now, I should say that plotting it on this scale makes it look a little better than it is right here. So there really is a hitch here between their measurements and the points on our line. But it does get the order right and predict that these two should be almost indistinguishable, but this one is a little smaller. This one is by far the smallest of all, and this is by far the largest. And the other guys are, of course, both in the order we predicted and even with the relative sizes we predicted, which was surprising to me. I would have been satisfied with the order, but to get it sort of on the nose like this was very, very cool. So I will stop there and leave some time for questions at the end. These are our funders, and we're very grateful to them as well as to you for listening and to the organizers for arranging this. Thank you.
That's really great, Jason. Thank you for this wonderful talk where you see these amazing. Actually, I'm amazed. You kind of been very modest in saying that you would have been just happy about the order in which these results presented things. These were run. Can you explain better? When you said what was the actual experiment and what was the numerical simulation? I guess that you started mentioning some data based on simulations, and then they ran experiments. Sorry, towards the end.
Right. So here for this one.
No, just before. When you just introduced these various graph types, that was based on what? On some assumptions, of course. Why we have exactly this one?
I
so
see.
This is just.
Okay, because what they know is that the pink molecule can bond in 2s or 3s. To each other. So
right.
These are the graph types where that can happen, right? These are more or less a list of connected graphs where this is going to happen. So there have to be 4 yellow molecules, each of which is a 3-way junction between green monomers. There have to be 6 pink molecules which can bond to each other in any group of 2 or any group of 3. So the possibilities are no pinks are bonded, in which case you have to get this tree.
Okay.
Pinks are bonded in 3 pairs. In that case, you have to get this sort of multi-handcuffs graph, or you can bond the 3 pinks in pairs and get this graph, which is sort of a theta graph with a tail with another loop. Or you can get this graph, which turns out to be K4.
Mhm.
And then the other possibility, right, is that you could bond the pinks in 2 groups of 3 instead of 3 groups of 2. If you do that,
Right.
the options are this ladder graph here or this K33 here. So you can't see it too well in the picture, but each of these junctions has 3 pink molecules shown bonded together, and each of these has 3 pink molecules shown bonded together. So
Right.
how did they know they had that? Because they could count the number of yellow molecules they had and the number of pink molecules they had by spectroscopy, like it's like gas chromatography or something. And then they could purify a sample where they knew the molecular weight, they knew the count of pinks and the count of yellows and the count of greens. Um, and then from there, they just listed all the possible graph types and said, unless there's something weird going on, we would expect this to fractionate into 6 groups by graph type. So a big mystery for them actually was distinguishing between the ladder graph and the K33, because both of them have the pinks bonded in 2 groups of 3. And so, you know, which one is it? One was bigger and one was smaller. And it turned out that this is the small one and the ladder graph is the big one. You could
Wow.
see this here, right? So they wanted to know, you know, how should I distinguish between these, this red curve here and this blue one? Similarly,
Sure.
they weren't sure for a while what to do with these two, but they were able to check in a different way that the identification of each of the pieces.
And if I may, one more question is about the experiment. Is this a kind of sedimentation driven by gravity, or?
Um, yeah, what's drawing the molecules through the column is gravity. Um,
Right.
so it's a kind of sedimentation. Um, it's just that the column is full of these beads. So, as they sediment, um,
Yes.
there's a slight
They
difference in
have.
how the big ones and the little ones sediment.
Right. It's interesting. It reminds us of a percolation kind of problem where these polymers have to find their ways through a random distribution of beads or something like that.
Oh yeah, actually modeling what happens in the column is fascinating. But
Must be.
chemists seem, the chemists I've talked to seem relatively uninterested in doing that. They just say that you have to understand that this is like 17 consecutive fractionations later, so it takes something like 60 hours continuously to pull these things apart. And they just say, look, the order in which it comes out correlates really well with radius of gyration and hydrodynamic radius. So this is one way to measure it. The other way to measure it is neutron scattering, and we have other collaborators who are getting data that way. So we should be able to compare not just with size exclusion chromatography, but also with neutron scattering.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well, thank
I,
you
I
all
would
for
have a
attending.
question.
Oh, of
Oh,
course.
yes, I took a while to enable the mic. So the question was that now you have modeled the situation where you assume that they are somehow distributed randomly with some Gaussian. Is there any hope that there are experiments where you use a different distribution, or actually there's some dynamics that also plays a role?
That would be very cool, right? So let me go back. Okay, so this basic picture that the admissible edges are a linear subspace of edge space, right, means that you could put any distribution you wanted on this linear subspace. And its push forward under this linear map would be the distribution of vertices. So, for instance, you could put a distribution which had some repulsion between vertices that were not bonded by a monomer. That's like an excluded volume model. Or you could constrain the edges to all be length 1 or something. And we've done numerical experiments along these lines. And it works, which is cool. I mean, you get samples. We're still proving that the samples are correct. And of course, it's much harder to analyze theoretically because, Gaussians are like the nicest possible distribution.
Okay, thank you very much.
Excellent.
Does that work? Can I ask
I
a
can hear
question?
you.
Hi, great. Hi, Jason. So I've got a question. So
Hi, Mark.
could you generalize this construction that you've done for graphs to more general cell complexes? So you could then construct a sort of arbitrary cell complex, say via triangulations, and then play, rather than playing with this stuff with just looking at lines, you could be looking at little surfaces that way, or even volumes if you're embedding them.
Oh, that's a neat idea. Like if you were to fix a triangulation of the sphere or something, then you could say there would be these compatibility conditions between the triangles that meant that the embedding sort of caused the sphere to close.
Precisely.
That would be
Or
really
even,
cool.
or with tori or something.
Well, so as you've maybe already guessed, this is the boundary operator from homology. So in principle, sure, you have a boundary operator from triangles to edges, right? And what you want is faces that are compatible with a choice of triangles, right? Which are compatible with a choice of vertices.
But you just
So
don't
just
want
keep
to intersect.
right. You don't want them to intersect. That of course is harder because this model it's only homology, right? So it's only talking about getting the topology of the surface right, but the geometry is however it comes out. Like if you look at this thing, then we have some experiments with ongoing right now with Joanna's group in Warsaw, where you classify the random theta curves you get. And of course, some of them are knotted. So if you were embedding spheres this way or something, you would certainly expect the spheres to have self-intersections a lot of the time.
At least if you're in R3.
At least if you're in R3. Yeah, that's right. So you might be better off if you were doing,
But I was wondering
Well,
if
I
you could
guess
do something with your distribution with your operators that somehow repel where the triangulations repel somehow.
Yeah, that's right. Like it shouldn't be just Gaussians. It should be some distribution that includes like a repulsive term or an embedding term or something. That would be really cool.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Are there more
Well,
questions? Please.
if no other questions, then I'd like to thank really Jason for this wonderful talk. Thank you very much, Jason. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll